Welcome to Calm Bedtime Stories. Please find a place to lie down and gently settle in. Let the quiet details of the Indian story slowly pull your attention away from the noise and any thoughts you might still be holding. We invite you now to simply breathe and listen as we begin this journey. If you find this quiet story helpful, consider subscribing to the channel and giving us a quiet like to help other weary minds find our restful content. The story of the land we now call India begins not with a bang, but with the slow geological shift of a subcontinent. Long, long ago, the Indian plate, a vast piece of the Earth's crust, drifted slowly, thousands of miles, until it collided with the much larger Eurasian plate. This immense grinding collision, occurring over millions of years, pushed the Earth upward, creating the colossal, hushed peaks of the Himalayas, a natural towering wall separating the subcontinent from the rest of Asia. South of this immense quiet barrier, a vast fertile plain was formed, watered by mighty rivers. Of these rivers, the Indus was perhaps the most crucial. It is here along its slow, meandering course that the first true signs of complex human organization began to appear, almost 5,000 years ago. This was the birth of the Indus Valley Civilization, or Harappan civilization. It was an existence of quiet order. Unlike the loud monument-building empires of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Harappans built cities of remarkable uniformity. Two of their largest, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, were laid out with an almost tedious precision. Their streets ran in perfect, predictable grids. Their homes, made of baked brick, were all of a similar, functional design. There was a quiet attention to sanitation. They possessed advanced drainage systems, a testament to a civilization focused on pragmatic daily comfort rather than grand, spectacular displays of power. Who governed them or what gods they quietly worshipped remains a mystery. Their script, a series of simple seals and symbols, is still undeciphered. They left behind no great statues of kings, no elaborate tombs. They simply existed quietly, trading their goods, beads, shells, and pottery with distant lands, maintaining a long, peaceful stretch of predictable life, until gradually, and still somewhat mysteriously, this great, quiet civilization began to fade, leaving behind only the ghost of its ordered, brick-lined streets. This quiet disappearance marks the close of the first chapter.
Following the quiet decline of the Harappan world, a new sound began to filter into the subcontinent, a sound carried on the tongues of semi-nomadic groups. These were the Indo-Aryans, often simply called the Vedic people. They did not arrive in a sudden, crashing invasion, but rather trickled in slowly, over a long period, settling first in the northwestern regions and then spreading gently eastward into the Gangetic Plain. Their civilization was fundamentally different from the orderly brick-bound existence of the Harappans. The Vedic people were organized around tribal units and were primarily pastoral, focused on their cattle. The cow, in their worldview, was a measure of wealth and a sacred entity, a quiet provider. Their most enduring legacy is not found in ruins or cities, but in a vast oral tradition known as the Vedas. These were collections of hymns, prayers, and philosophical treatises, meticulously preserved and passed down through generations by Brahmin priests. The earliest and most important of these is the Rig Veda, which offers a glimpse into their early beliefs, simple sacrifices made to elemental gods like Indra, the god of storm and war, and Agni, the fire god. As their society settled and grew more complex, it began to quietly formalize into a structure known as the Varna system, or class hierarchy. This system divided society into four main groups: the Brahmins, priests and scholars; the Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers; the Vaishyas, merchants and farmers; and the Shudras, laborers. This quiet stratification, initially flexible, would later harden into the rigid system of caste, shaping social life across the subcontinent for millennia to follow. The slow eastward movement of the Vedic people culminated in the establishment of small territorial kingdoms known as Mahajanapadas. These kingdoms marked the close of the early nomadic period and signaled a quiet transition toward the first true states in the north, setting the stage for more formalized rule. As the early kingdoms quietly solidified their hold on the Gangetic Plain, the 6th century BCE became a time of subtle but profound intellectual and spiritual stirring. Life, though structured by the Vedic tradition, began to feel restrictive for some. This quiet discontent gave rise to new philosophies, known as the Shramana movements, which questioned the established authority of the Brahmanical rituals. Two of these movements would grow far beyond their origins. The first was Jainism, founded by Mahavira. His teachings emphasized a path of absolute nonviolence, or ahimsa, extending even to the smallest insects. He advocated for rigorous self-discipline, asceticism, and the quiet rejection of material possessions as the means to liberation. The second was Buddhism, established by Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. His revelation centered on the Four Noble Truths: that life is suffering, that suffering is caused by desire, that suffering can cease, and that the way to cease suffering is the Eightfold Path, a middle way between extreme indulgence and extreme asceticism. The Buddha preached a quiet, gentle message of introspection and ethical conduct, open to all, regardless of caste. Meanwhile, in the secular world, a major political consolidation was taking place.
By the 4th century BCE, the kingdom of Magadha, benefiting from its rich iron deposits and strategic location, quietly absorbed its rivals. The Nanda dynasty laid the groundwork, but the true imperial structure was built by the Maurya dynasty, founded by Chandragupta Maurya. The greatest quiet expansion of this empire, however, occurred under Ashoka the Great. After a single brutal war in Kalinga, the sheer scale of the quiet suffering caused a profound change in Ashoka. He renounced military conquest and quietly embraced the principles of Buddhism, dedicating his reign to propagating Dhamma, a concept encompassing righteousness, social welfare, and quiet moral behavior. His edicts, inscribed on pillars and rocks across his vast domain, stand as a testament to this unique, peaceful rule. This quiet, vast empire represented the first truly unified political entity across the subcontinent.
The great Mauryan Empire, though vast and powerful under Ashoka, did not last forever. After his quiet passing, the centralized authority began to slowly weaken. Lacking a strong successor, the empire fractured, leading to a long period of political decentralization across much of the subcontinent. In the northwest, foreign powers quietly entered the vacuum. Waves of diverse groups, including the Indo-Greeks, the Sakas or Scythians, and later the Parthians, established short-lived kingdoms. Of these, the Kushana Empire became the most significant, briefly uniting a large territory that stretched from Central Asia down into northern India. Under the Kushanas, especially King Kanishka, Buddhism saw a quiet, widespread flowering and was transmitted along the Silk Road into China and beyond. Meanwhile, the southern parts of the subcontinent, separated by geography and culture, followed their own quiet trajectory. Here, in the region known as South India, three distinct early kingdoms known as the Cholas, the Cheras, and the Pandyas, collectively known as the Triumvirate, quietly flourished. This era is known as the Sangam period, named after the assemblies of poets who created a rich body of Tamil literature. Their focus was on maritime trade, establishing quiet, far-reaching links with the Roman Empire and Southeast Asia, exchanging spices and textiles for gold. Across the fragmented landscape, a quiet shift in spiritual thought was occurring. The Vedic religion began to slowly transform into what would eventually be recognized as Hinduism. Key deities like Vishnu and Shiva rose in prominence, and the foundational texts of the Upanishads and the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, were quietly finalized and widely circulated. This period, characterized by regional powers and subtle cultural blending, was a necessary bridge before the next great quiet consolidation of power in the north. Following the quiet, fragmented centuries, a new, powerful native dynasty quietly asserted control in the northern plains. This was the Gupta Empire, which emerged around the 4th century CE. It is often referred to by historians as the Golden Age of India, though the changes were often subtle and intellectual rather than loud and political. The Guptas established a stable political framework, but unlike the Mauryas, their administration was more decentralized. They preferred to rule through a system of local chieftains and vassal kings who paid quiet tribute, allowing regional cultures to flourish while maintaining overall imperial peace. Under Gupta patronage, the arts, sciences, and literature reached new, quiet heights. Sanskrit, the ancient language of the Vedas, was refined and standardized. It was during this time that the great poet and dramatist Kalidasa quietly created masterpieces like Abhignana Sakuntalam, the recognition of Sakuntala. In the realm of science and mathematics, the advances were particularly profound. Scholars like Aryabhata quietly calculated the value of pi with great accuracy and proposed that the Earth was spherical and rotated on its own axis long before similar theories gained traction in the West. It is also believed that the concept of zero and the decimal system, foundational tools for modern mathematics, were quietly formalized and disseminated during this period. In religion, the devotional forms of Hinduism, known as bhakti, grew quietly stronger. Magnificent, though often destroyed, stone temples were built dedicated to Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess. These temples featured complex carvings and marked the quiet emergence of classical Hindu architecture. However, even the Golden Age had a quiet end. Beginning in the late 5th century, repeated quiet incursions by the Hunas, a group related to the Huns, severely weakened the empire. By the mid-5th century, the Gupta Empire had quietly dissolved into a mosaic of small independent kingdoms, leading again to regionalization. While the North was again quietly dividing into regional powers after the Gupta decline, such as the short-lived empire of Harsha Vardhana, the South continued its own remarkable and quiet development. The centuries following the Gupta era saw the rise of magnificent, powerful dynasties in the Deccan and the far south. The most prominent of these were the Pallavas and the Chalukyas. The Pallavas, based in Kanchipuram, were patrons of monumental architecture, developing the early styles of Dravidian temple construction. They quietly carved out massive rock-cut temples, evolving into structural temples that became increasingly elaborate over time. The coastal town of Mahabalipuram stands as a quiet testament to their artistic skill. Rivaling them were the Chalukyas, who established their capital at Badami.
Their rule saw a quiet, sustained period of political and military competition with the Pallavas. This rivalry, though occasionally erupting in conflict, also drove cultural innovation, with both dynasties leaving behind rich legacies of temple art in places like Aihole and Patadakal. Further south, the Cholas were quietly laying the groundwork for a future maritime empire. While they were not yet at the peak of their power, they maintained a consistent cultural and economic presence, heavily invested in the quiet profitability of the sea. In the north, the absence of a single unified power led to centuries of quiet internal struggle among various regional kingdoms, often referred to as the Rajput states. These groups, characterized by a fierce warrior ethos, engaged in constant small-scale conflicts. They quietly controlled territories that would become key entry points for later external influences. This enduring regionalism of the South, coupled with the persistent fragmentation of the North, defined the quiet political landscape just before the arrival of new forces from the West and Central Asia.
Starting around the 8th century CE, the political and cultural geography of the subcontinent began to quietly change due to sustained contact with forces from the West. The first significant arrival was the quiet invasion of Sind by Arab forces in 712 CE, primarily motivated by trade and territory, though this initial conquest remained largely localized. The more impactful and frequent incursions began later, around the 11th century, led by Turkic rulers from Central Asia. Figures like Mahmud of Ghazni conducted a series of raids into northern India. His primary motivation was the acquisition of immense wealth stored in temples, leading to the quiet destruction of religious centers, though he established no lasting empire. The decisive change came later, with the invasion led by Muhammad of Ghor in the late 12th century. His victory in the Second Battle of Touraine in 1192 CE marked the quiet end of significant Rajput dominance in the north and led to the establishment of permanent rule. Following Muhammad of Ghor's assassination, his general, Qutb al-Aibak, quietly established himself as the ruler of the newly conquered territories centered around Delhi. This act marked the beginning of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206 CE. The Sultanate was not a single continuous entity, but a succession of 5 distinct, often short-lived dynasties: the Mamluks, slave dynasty, the Khaljis, the Tughlaqs, the Sayyids, and the Lodis. For over 3 centuries, these dynasties quietly governed large parts of the north, introducing new political and administrative practices and forging a unique cultural blend. Persian became the language of administration and high culture, quietly influencing local languages and customs. The gradual, quiet blending of indigenous Indian traditions with Islamic and Central Asian styles of architecture, art, and music defined this era, laying the groundwork for the great empires that would soon follow.
While the Delhi Sultanate quietly consolidated its power in the north, the Chola dynasty in the south reached the zenith of its power, creating a remarkable maritime empire. Starting around the 9th century, they emerged as the dominant force in peninsular India and quietly extended their influence overseas. The greatest of the Chola kings, particularly Rajaraja I and his son Rajendra I, led naval expeditions that brought the islands of the Maldives and parts of Southeast Asia, including the Srivijaya Kingdom in modern Indonesia, under their quiet sphere of influence. Their control over the sea lanes made them quiet masters of the lucrative trade routes connecting India, China, and the islands of the East. The wealth generated by this extensive trade supported an era of spectacular, quiet cultural and architectural achievement. The Cholas were the great patrons of temple building, culminating in masterpieces like the Brihadishwarar Temple at Tanjavur, a massive yet elegantly proportioned structure. Image of the Brihadishwarar Temple. Their bronzes, especially the iconic depictions of Shiva as Nataraja, the Lord of Dance, are revered worldwide for their quiet beauty and technical mastery. Simultaneously, a profound and quiet religious shift was taking place across the entire subcontinent, accelerating during this period. The movement known as Bhakti intensified. Unlike the earlier, formal Vedic rituals, Bhakti focused on a deeply personal, emotional, and quiet devotion to a specific deity. Saints and mystics traveled quietly, singing hymns and compositions in regional languages like Tamil, Kannada, and Marathi, making religious philosophy accessible to common people, irrespective of their social standing. This quiet wave of spiritual democracy helped to reshape the spiritual landscape, emphasizing a direct, loving relationship between the devotee and God, often subtly challenging the rigidities of the existing social structure.
The long period of the fragmented Delhi Sultanate began to quietly draw to a close in the early 16th century. The last dynasty of the Sultanate, the Lodis, had grown weak and unpopular, leading to internal dissension and a quiet invitation for external forces. The crucial change came with the arrival of Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur. Babur was a quiet, ambitious prince from Fergana, a region in Central Asia, and a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan. Driven from his ancestral homeland, he turned his quiet attention toward the rich plains of Hindustan. In 1526 CE, Babur quietly led a smaller but strategically superior army against the vast forces of the Lodi Sultan, Ibrahim Lodi, at the First Battle of Panipat. This battle,
fought near the historic city north of Delhi, was a quiet turning point in Indian history. Babur's use of gunpowder artillery and the innovative tactical formation known as Tulguma completely overwhelmed the Lodi army despite being heavily outnumbered. Ibrahim Lodi was quietly defeated and killed, and Babur claimed the throne of Delhi. This victory marked the quiet, firm establishment of the Mughal Empire, which would grow to encompass nearly the entire subcontinent. The name Mughal was a Persianized term for Mongol, though Babur's lineage and culture were predominantly Turkic and Persian. He began the quiet task of consolidating his rule, establishing an initial administrative structure, and setting the tone for the great artistic and cultural synthesis that the dynasty would later embody. His reign, though short, quietly ensured that the focus of power shifted permanently from the fragmented Afghan Sultanate to a new, dynamic, and enduring imperial authority.
Following Babur's initial quiet conquest, the Mughal Empire underwent a period of consolidation and immense expansion, reaching its quiet zenith under three remarkable rulers: Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. Akbar the Great, who reigned for nearly 50 years, 1556 to 1605, was the quiet architect of the empire's political stability. He understood that ruling a diverse subcontinent required quiet tolerance. He abolished the jizya, the tax traditionally levied on non-Muslims, and engaged in quiet philosophical debates with scholars of various faiths in his Ibadat Khana, or house of worship. This policy of quiet inclusion, known as Sul-i-Kul, or peace to all, formed the backbone of the empire's long survival. He also formalized the administrative structure through the Mansabdari system, quietly managing the nobility and the military. His son Jahangir reigned over a period of great quiet artistic flowering, particularly in Mughal miniature painting. He was a quiet connoisseur of art and nature, and the courts of the time produced exquisite, detailed portraits and quiet scenes of court life. Jahangir's successor, Shah Jahan, is known for the grand, quiet architecture he commissioned, which synthesized Persian, Islamic, and Indian styles. His most famous creation, the Taj Mahal, built in memory of his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, stands as a quiet, symmetrical monument of white marble. He also quietly oversaw the construction of the magnificent Red Fort in Delhi and the famous Peacock Throne. These emperors presided over a period of quiet economic prosperity, driven by an efficient land revenue system and extensive trade. The Mughal India was globally famous for its fine textiles, spices, and quiet artisanal craftsmanship. The empire thus was not only a political entity, but a quiet, powerful cultural and economic heartland, until the rigid policies of the later emperors would begin the slow, quiet process of imperial decline.
The quiet glory of the Mughal Empire began its slow, inevitable retreat under Aurangzeb, who reigned from 1658 to 1707. His reign was the longest of the major Mughal emperors, but his policies often worked quietly against the stable foundations established by his ancestors, particularly Akbar. Unlike the inclusive approach of his predecessors, Aurangzeb pursued a more orthodox and less tolerant religious policy. He reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims, restricted the construction of new temples, and alienated many groups, including the powerful Rajputs, who had been loyal allies, and the Sikhs in the Punjab, whose relationship with the empire severely deteriorated during this period. He spent the latter half of his long life focused on the Deccan campaign in the south, attempting to quietly conquer the Deccan sultanates and subdue the rising power of the Marathas. The Marathas, under their charismatic leader Shivaji, had quietly organized themselves into a formidable military force based on guerrilla warfare. Aurangzeb's continuous, costly wars in the Deccan drained the imperial treasury and stretched the administrative machinery to its breaking point. His centralized rule was ultimately undermined by its own overreach. The endless military focus and the quiet resistance triggered by his policies led to a massive increase in regional autonomy. When Aurangzeb finally passed away, the vast, quiet structure of the empire was already hollowed out. The governors and local administrators quietly asserted their independence, transforming themselves into hereditary regional rulers. This period immediately following his death is known as the era of the later Mughals, characterized by weak central authority, internal court intrigue, and the quiet, steady disintegration of the once unshakable Mughal peace. This fragmentation created the political and economic instability that invited new external players.
With the quiet fracturing of the great Mughal Empire following Aurangzeb's death, the 18th century became an era of shifting alliances and the vigorous growth of new, powerful regional states. These groups quietly asserted their independence, transforming former Mughal provinces into sovereign entities. In the south, the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Nawab of Bengal quietly established hereditary rule, maintaining a nominal link to the fading Mughal emperor while operating as fully independent rulers. The Sikhs organized themselves into powerful misls or confederacies in the Punjab, setting the stage for the later unified Sikh kingdom. The most significant indigenous power to emerge was the Maratha Confederacy. Having quietly resisted Aurangzeb's armies, they rose from a regional power in the Deccan to an all-India empire. The effective control of the Confederacy shifted from the Maratha royal line to the Peshwas, hereditary chief ministers who ruled from Pune. The Maratha armies quietly expanded their influence across central and northern India, challenging the authority of the later Mughals, and even collecting revenue, the chauth and sardeshmukhi, from large territories.
However, this quiet expansion led them into a catastrophic conflict with the rising Afghan power. The Third Battle of Panipat in 1761 pitted the vast Maratha forces against the Afghan army of Ahmed Shah Abdali. The Marathas suffered a devastating loss, which quietly checked their dominance in the north and prevented them from fully replacing the Mughals as the central imperial power. While the Marathas did not disappear, their loose confederacy structure and the quiet struggle for power among their chiefs left them vulnerable. This persistent regional fragmentation, combined with the strategic weakening of the most powerful native contender, created the perfect quiet opportunity for a new external force to begin inserting itself into the political vacuum.
While the indigenous powers of the 18th century quietly struggled for dominance, a new, highly organized external force was slowly but surely establishing its quiet presence on the coasts: the European trading companies. These companies initially arrived seeking to quietly participate in the lucrative spice, textile, and commodity trade that defined the Indian Ocean networks. The first to establish a significant foothold were the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, the French, and the British. The British presence was primarily channeled through the East India Company, which received its quiet royal charter in 1600. Initially, the EIC's activities were confined to establishing fortified trading posts, known as factories, in coastal cities like Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. They quietly operated under the nominal authority of the Mughal Emperor or local Nawabs, focused only on commerce and securing favorable tax and trade terms. However, as the Mughal central authority quietly disintegrated, the European companies began to change their quiet role. They realized that political control was the key to maximizing profits and eliminating their European rivals. They began to quietly recruit and train their own private armies, composed mostly of Indian soldiers known as sepoys, which were used to protect their trading interests and influence local politics. The quiet, intense rivalry between the British East India Company and the French East India Company ultimately led to the Carnatic Wars in the mid-18th century. These conflicts, fought primarily on Indian soil, effectively eliminated the French as a serious political power, leaving the British East India Company as the unchallenged European commercial and military contender, poised to transition from a trading corporation to a territorial ruler. This shift was a quiet but profound change in the subcontinent's trajectory.
The transformation of the British East India Company from a commercial entity to a quiet territorial power hinged on the wealthy province of Bengal. The decisive moment arrived in the mid-18th century, stemming from a quiet conflict over trade privileges and political authority with the Nawab of Bengal, Suraj-ud-Dowlah. The confrontation culminated in the Battle of Plassey in 1757.
This was less a fierce battle and more a quiet betrayal. The company's forces, led by Robert Clive, quietly secured the allegiance of the Nawab's key commander, Mir Jafar, by promising him the throne. As a result, the Nawab's large army offered only quiet, token resistance. The victory at Plassey gave the British effective control over Bengal, a region rich in resources and revenue. They installed a series of puppet Nawabs who were forced to grant vast sums of money and land rights to the company. The second crucial military step was the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Here, the company's forces defeated a combined army of the Nawab of Awadh, the exiled Nawab of Bengal, and the Mughal Emperor himself. The subsequent Treaty of Allahabad in 1765 granted the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani was the quiet right to collect and administer the land revenue of these vast territories. This single grant was the most significant acquisition of power, transforming the company overnight into the de facto revenue administrator and political master of eastern India. They now commanded immense financial resources and ceased relying on silver imports to fund their trade. This quiet control over revenue marked the true beginning of the Company Raj, shifting the focus from coastal trade to inland governance and the steady, quiet expansion of their political control across the subcontinent.
Following the quiet acquisition of Bengal's revenue rights, the East India Company spent the latter half of the 18th century and the early 19th century in a process of quiet, relentless territorial expansion. This was driven by a complex interplay of political strategy, commercial greed, and the ongoing need to finance its vast administrative and military structure. The company systematically engaged in a series of quiet, decisive wars against the remaining major indigenous powers. The four Anglo-Mysore Wars, 1767 to 1799, ultimately subdued the fierce resistance of the Sultanate of Mysore, led first by Hyder Ali and then by his son Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan's final defeat marked the quiet annexation of large parts of South India. Similarly, the three Anglo-Maratha Wars, 1775 to 1818, saw the gradual, quiet dismantling of the powerful Maratha Confederacy. The ultimate defeat of the Peshwa and the dissolution of the decentralized Maratha power quieted the last significant pan-Indian resistance in the central and western parts of the subcontinent. The company used a dual strategy for this quiet consolidation. First, outright annexation of territories through war and direct rule. Second, the use of the subsidiary alliance system introduced by Governor-General Lord Wellesley. This system quietly required Indian princely states to disband their own armies and instead pay for a permanent British force stationed in their territory. It placed the quiet protection and foreign relations of the state under company control, effectively rendering the rulers powerless clients.
By the mid-19th century, the company quietly governed 2/3 of the subcontinent directly, while the remaining 1/3 was comprised of over 600 princely states that were politically subservient to the British Crown. The period of quiet commercial activity had fully morphed into an overwhelming political empire, setting the stage for direct confrontations between the rulers and the ruled.
The quiet consolidation of the Company Raj brought with it profound and disruptive changes to Indian society. The company's policies, designed primarily to serve British commercial and strategic interests, quietly alienated large segments of the population. This quiet resentment simmered beneath the surface, fueled by various factors. There was deep-seated economic distress due to heavy land revenue demands and the destruction of traditional crafts by the influx of machine-made British goods. Socially, the introduction of reforms such as the abolition of sati and the legalization of widow remarriage, though progressive, were viewed by many traditionalists as quiet interference in their religious and social customs. The immediate trigger for the eruption of this discontent was a quiet grievance within the company's own army. The sepoys, the Indian soldiers who formed the bulk of the company's forces, grew increasingly disaffected by issues of pay, promotion, and the infamous new rifle cartridges. These cartridges were rumored to be greased with the fat of cows and pigs, an extreme affront to both Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs, requiring them to quietly bite the paper cover before loading. The discontent burst forth in a great wave of rebellion in 1857. Starting with the Sepoy Revolt in Meerut, the uprising quickly spread across north and central India, drawing in displaced nobles, disgruntled peasants, and local rulers. Though the rebels initially captured Delhi and declared the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as their nominal leader, the lack of quiet, centralized leadership and coordination ultimately allowed the better equipped and unified British forces to suppress the rebellion with quiet brutality. The revolt of 1857 was a watershed moment. It quietly convinced the British Parliament that the East India Company was incapable of properly governing the vast territory. In 1858, the British Crown quietly dissolved the company and assumed direct responsibility for the governance of India. This act formally marked the beginning of the British Raj.
The transfer of power in 1858 ushered in a period of direct rule by the British Crown, known as the British Raj. This era focused on creating a stable, efficient, and quietly exploitative administrative structure designed to serve the strategic and economic interests of the British Empire. The highest authority was vested in the Secretary of State for India in London. On the ground, the country was governed by the Viceroy, who was the Queen's representative. The administration was a highly centralized system managed by the elite Indian Civil Service, ICS, a small group of mostly British officers who quietly controlled all key administrative, judicial, and revenue functions across the vast territory. Economically, the Raj quietly intensified India's role as a supplier of raw materials such as cotton, jute,
and indigo for British industries and as a captive market for finished British goods. This policy led to the continued deindustrialization of India and widespread rural poverty as traditional industries were systematically undermined. Infrastructural development was undertaken, but primarily to serve imperial needs. An extensive network of railways was quietly built not primarily for public convenience, but to move troops, raw materials to ports, and finished goods to inland markets. Similarly, the telegraph system was introduced to ensure rapid administrative control. The British also formalized and codified the legal system, establishing courts and legal procedures based on English law. While this introduced a degree of quiet uniformity, it often failed to account for complex local customs and created a judiciary accessible primarily to the wealthy. This period was characterized by a quiet and immense concentration of power, bureaucratic control, and economic extraction, laying the foundation for an eventual organized resistance.
Despite the quiet efficiency of the British administration, the very structures it introduced inadvertently fostered the growth of an all-India political consciousness. The establishment of modern communication networks, the railways and the telegraph, and the introduction of a common English-based education system quietly enabled the educated elite across different regions to connect, share ideas, and perceive their shared condition under foreign rule. This awareness led to the quiet emergence of organized political associations. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was quietly founded in Bombay. It was established by both Indian and European elites, initially as a platform for quiet, educated dialogue with the British administration. In its early years, the INC was dominated by moderates who followed a path of quiet petitioning and constitutional methods. Leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji quietly exposed the economic exploitation through his drain of wealth theory, arguing that India's resources were being systematically siphoned off to Britain without adequate return. However, a younger generation soon emerged, becoming known as the extremists. They favored more assertive and direct action, feeling that the British would never quietly concede power through mere appeals. Leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak quietly popularized the slogan, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it." The quiet discontent was amplified by the British action of partitioning Bengal in 1905, ostensibly for administrative ease, but widely seen as a deliberate attempt to quietly divide Hindus and Muslims. This sparked the widespread Swadeshi movement, advocating for the quiet boycott of foreign goods and the promotion of indigenous products. This quiet, organized resistance marked the true beginning of the mass phase of the freedom struggle, shifting the movement from drawing room debates to street protests.
The Indian independence movement underwent its most profound and quiet transformation with the arrival of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi on the political scene. Returning to India in 1915 after 2 decades of legal and political activism in South Africa, Gandhi quickly recognized the need to shift the struggle from the elite halls of Congress to the vast majority of the Indian population, the peasants, workers, and common people. Gandhi introduced the core concepts of satyagraha, or truth force, or soul force, and ahimsa, or nonviolence, as the central tenets of resistance. He argued that the British Empire's quiet power was based on the cooperation of the Indian people, and that organized, nonviolent non-cooperation could quietly dismantle it. His leadership marked the quiet transition to mass politics. He initiated a series of localized movements, like the Champaran struggle for peasants and the Kedah campaign for farmers, to demonstrate the effectiveness of his methods. His ultimate goal was Purna Swaraj, or complete independence. The movement escalated dramatically with the non-cooperation movement 1920 to 1922 and the civil disobedience movement 1930 to 1934. The latter was famously launched with the Dandi March, or Salt Satyagraha, where Gandhi and his followers quietly marched to the sea to illegally manufacture salt, symbolically challenging the British monopoly over a fundamental necessity of life. Meanwhile, the issue of communal identity began to quietly complicate the struggle. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, grew increasingly assertive in its demand for separate safeguards and eventually a separate Muslim state. The British, operating under a policy of divide and rule, quietly encouraged these schisms, using them as a justification to delay full independence. The path to freedom therefore became entangled with the quiet but growing demands for partition.
The final push for independence occurred during and immediately after the Second World War. The British relied heavily on India's resources and manpower during the conflict, but their refusal to grant immediate self-rule quietly undermined their moral authority. In 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, demanding the complete withdrawal of the British. Despite the quiet imprisonment of the entire Congress leadership, the movement spread into widespread spontaneous acts of resistance across the land. After the war ended in 1945, a financially exhausted Britain facing internal labor unrest and widespread international pressure, quietly acknowledged that its hold on India was unsustainable. Negotiations for the transfer of power began in earnest, but they were tragically overshadowed by the escalating demands for partition. The Muslim League's call for a separate homeland, Pakistan, grew insistent,
fueled by quiet communal tensions and the failure of all parties to agree on a constitutional framework that guaranteed the safety and rights of the Muslim minority in a united India. The quiet but terrifying outbreak of widespread communal riots convinced key leaders, including the Viceroy Lord Mountbatten, that partition was the only quick, if tragic, path to avoid a full-scale civil war. The final act was the passing of the Indian Independence Act in July 1947. The date set for the quiet transfer of power was August 15, 1947. The subcontinent was quickly and arbitrarily divided along lines drawn by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a boundary commission lawyer who had never visited India. On August 15, 1947, the quiet dawn of independence arrived, but it was marked by immense human tragedy. The process of partition resulted in one of the largest mass migrations in human history, accompanied by terrible violence and the displacement of millions. The ancient land of India was quietly but irrevocably split into two sovereign nations, the secular Republic of India and the new Dominion of Pakistan. This quiet, momentous event closed the long chapter of foreign rule and opened the uncertain democratic future of the newly independent Indian nation.